You're back with the Powerful Communication podcast from Comsteria. This is Colin Kelly. I hope all's well with you. One of the things that we spend some time on in our media training sessions is not just telling clients how to handle the media and how to give better interviews and how to raise their profile, but explaining a little bit about how the media works. And I think that it's worth me talking about this on the podcast today in the wake of what Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook announced the other night, where he basically said Facebook is no longer going to act like a publisher. We're just a distributor. They're no longer going to fact check. They're no longer really going to censor. They will have a team and systems that go after the most outrageously illegal, offensive, devastating material. But your regular misinformation, Facebook don't care. They kind of see that as two sides of an argument. They see that as free speech, and they're just going to let you crack on. That has opened up, I think, a huge opportunity for legitimate mainstream media organizations to come and fill that void. If Facebook doesn't really care about news and about accuracy, who does? Well, although they're maybe having a tough time, the mainstream legacy media, newspapers, they're still going. And of course they've made mistakes and they don't get everything right, but most of them have physical premises, so you know where they are. They have people working there who are trained to some level. And again, you know who they are. There's articles that are bylined. So there's some accountability and there's some responsibility. And while you might not agree with the way it's always applied, there is at least some level of regulation. In newspapers, it's largely self-regulation and it's quite loose. I get that. In broadcast, it's a bit tougher. There are rules about balance, there's rules about impartiality, and there are consequences, and we've seen fines and sanctions just over the last few months with some of our broadcasters. I wanted to talk a little bit today because I've just bought my local newspaper for the first time in a few weeks. I wanted to talk a little bit about how it's put together and how this all works and how local journalism operates in the UK. So my local newspaper is the Paisley Daily Express. It's part of an organisation called Reach PLC, which used to be called Trinity Mirror, which was the Mirror Group, which, if you go all the way back, ultimately was part of Robert Maxwell's publishing empire in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and then there were takeovers and mergers and all sorts of things. The Daily Record is part of this group. The Daily Record is part of Reach PLC, part of Trinity Mirror, part of the same operation that includes a network of local newspapers, including the Paisley Daily Express. Now, when I was a kid and I did my work experience at 16, the Paisley Daily Express had an office with its logo on it. It had a sales operation. It had a newsroom up the stairs. It had several reporters, sports reporters that would go to the games. You could walk in off the street and tell them a story, and they would print it the next day, usually, in the newspaper. It's changed now. I think it's fair to say that the reporter headcount has reduced. There's far greater sharing of resources. And that office in New Street in Paisley with the logo on it that you could just walk in off the street, that's gone now. And the Paisley Daily Express staff are working out of a centralised Reach PLC office in Glasgow city centre in Douglas Street. The important thing, while it might be slightly harder to track these people down and go in and see them, the important thing is the title still exists. Now, they don't all still exist. There has been some rationalisation. There has been some closures. But the Paisley Daily Express still exists. And one of the things that has kept local media, local news sustainable is a programme called the Local Democracy Scheme. Now, this, believe it or not, was launched by the Conservative government a few years back. I think it was in the David Cameron era, where there was a lot of concern about, local media is really struggling, social media has come in, they're having a really tough time. What are we going to do for local news? What about people who are not, digital natives, who don't have computers or broadband? They don't have the same access. Maybe they are older, maybe they're vulnerable people in our communities, and they need local news so they know what's going on, So, for example, if there's a planning application, or if there's going to be a road closure, or if there was some kind of safety issue, that's where local news can be really important. And so the Conservative government at the time decided that what they would do is they would use some of the BBC licence fee money to fund a network of what they call local democracy reporters. And the idea was, at the very least, these local newspapers could sustain with local authority news. So your local authority have basically council meetings, and, in the old days, the newspapers would send reporters along. They would get a lot of stories out of those council meetings. And some of them could be a bit dry, but over time, there was some really quite important stuff goes on in your local authority. Because in terms of your day-to-day life and things like roads and housing and education, that's where these decisions are made, rather than Holyrood or the Westminster government. So the idea was to put some funding in, not always, but often, to local newspaper organisations to protect that work, so that they would still be able to cover what the local council are doing. They'd still be able, then they might keep the local newspaper running, and these maybe vulnerable or disadvantaged people in communities would still be able to access a local newspaper and find out what was going on. And so that's the local democracy scheme. Now, across the UK, it's UK-wide, so it's England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. There's 165 local democracy reporters. The roles are funded by the BBC, but these reporters are employed and answerable to their assigned organisation. Right, so the money comes out the BBC licence fee, but you're employed by, and you go into work with, this particular local newspaper or whoever it is that's signed up to the local democracy scheme. So in a sense, they get a funded role. But there are restrictions on what that role can do. So the local democracy reporter, for example, if the council meeting's a bit quiet this week, you can't assign the democracy reporter and tell them to go off and do a paid-for advertorial for the local double glazing company, right? That's not allowed within the scheme. There's a bit of leeway, but really what they need to be doing is spending their time covering stories of it, the way it's described as stories of the greatest public interest. There's an expectation that they'll go to council meetings, but if there's other things going on that are deemed in the public interest, then I understand that they can do that as well. The other thing that's important to note about this scheme is that the content that the local democracy reporter works on has to be shared with all the other members of the scheme. So the local democracy reporter that is employed by the Paisley Daily Express, every story that they publish gets shared around a network. It goes into like a news gathering system, I suppose a little bit like a news agency might work, where that material is then available for anyone else to use that's in that scheme. So if for some reason something happens in Paisley and the local democracy reporter goes and covers something at Renfrewshire Council, if that was somehow of interest to a news organisation in Plymouth or in Belfast that signed up to that same scheme, they would receive that content at the same time as the Paisley Daily Express or the Daily Record or whoever, and they can decide whether to use it or not. I am not 100% sure, but I think someone like STV, so the commercial television broadcaster here in Scotland, I think they're signed up to the scheme. So if your local democracy reporter who might be employed by a newspaper organisation, their story could run also on a commercial television website, or if they wanted maybe to get somebody to voice that story, it could go on the television news bulletin as well. So there's different news organisations signed up to the system, employing reporters, funded by the BBC, and then sharing all that content. The local democracy reporter has to say in advance, I think it's 7 days, what stories they're going to cover, where they're going to be, what they're going to be doing, so everybody knows where the resource is and it avoids duplication. So for example, if the commercial television broadcaster was signed up to the scheme, then they would know, the lad that works for the Paisley Daily Express. He's covering that council meeting in Paisley on Thursday. We don't need to send anyone. We'll just get what he files. So that's how it works. I think it works pretty well. I think it's really important for organisations to at least be aware of who your local democracy reporter is. Now, like I say, they're not really going to be doing commercial stories. They're probably not the person, if you're a local business and you expand or you launch a new website or you win an award, it's probably not going to be the local democracy reporter that would deal with that story. But if you are a public sector organisation, if you're in any way involved in local government or local politics, if you're at the community council, maybe if you are a big employer and you're doing something that might also overlap with the local authority, if you're the Chamber of Commerce, quite often those kinds of stories might involve a matter of great public interest, might also be something that, for example, a local councillor might comment on. So even if it doesn't go through the agenda of the local council meeting, if it's something that local councillors are interested in, then there is a good chance that the local democracy reporter might cover that story, and it might be someone that you would speak to or would ask you some questions and so on. So like I say, this morning I picked up the Paisley Daily Express and I just wanted, and obviously it's early January and things are a little bit quiet, but let's just go through the newspaper and look at where the news is coming from. So page 1 is the demolition work has now started on it's a very famous building in Paisley, the Territorial Army building. Beautiful old building, been a bit of a ruin for the last few years. There's been various campaigns to save it, and this week the demolition began. And that story, the byline on it is Jack Thompson, local democracy reporter. So he's covered this story. He's interviewed some local councillors who've talked about the sadness of losing this building. Some of them are quite angry about it. He's spoken to a variety of different councillors. He's told us what the construction company have been doing. He's talked about local campaigners. It's a really good, at times quite investigative piece that runs on the front page and all of page 4 and all of page 5 of the local newspaper, with pictures as well. And that's something else that's important to the local democracy scheme, is that where possible they are expected to file pictures. Now sometimes the newspaper might put another photographer on it if it merits that and if they can, or they might pull pictures out the archive, but also sometimes they might expect the local democracy reporter to do that. So that's the story on page 1, continues on 4 and 5, all written by the local democracy reporter Jack Thompson. If we go to page 2, Dargavel Village new school plans revealed. So this is a new primary school in Bishopton, and the planning permission has been filed by the local authority, and this story has been written by Jack Thompson, local democracy reporter. Now, where that story's come from is a planning application. Now, he's not regurgitated it word for word, but quite a bit of the detail in that story has come out of a planning application, and then he's added a little bit of background, a little bit of context. So page 1, page 2, local democracy reporter. Page 3 is written by someone called Taylor Murray, and this is about local high school raising money for a mental health charity with a 12-month physical and mental training program. Now, I don't know where that story's come from, but it's the kind of thing quite often it might come from a press release. So an organisation, in this case the school, has done something interesting, raised quite a bit of money, and they have shouted about it somewhere. Might have directly told the newspaper might have heard last year they were doing this fundraising push, they might have given them some publicity, and then the newspaper have thought, well, let's revisit this story. That work is now done, that's finished. Oh, how much did you raise? How did it go? And they've done a kind of follow-up. So that's page 3 with some pictures. My guess is, and it is only a guess, that those pictures have come from the school themselves. It's the school doing some of the challenges. I think they did the kilt walk to help raise some money. So that's page 3. That's from Taylor Murray. That's one of the other reporters at the Paisley Daily Express. Page 4 and 5 I've told you about. Page 6 is the archive and the crossword. So page 6 is a story from Paisley's past. It's a sort of a local legend, a local mystery, something you didn't know. This is about a blacksmith from 100 years ago. Then we've got the crossword. Then we've got the local MP has a column. So the top half of page 7 is the local MP, Alison Taylor, and her column. Now, quite often what we get, I think, across the week, the newspaper will try and go round the different political parties. So the MP has a column. I think they also feature the MSP, who's from a different party, and they try and make sure there's a bit of balance. And that's something, they don't need to do that, but it's good practice. It certainly helps in terms of the newspaper's relations with the elected representatives, making sure that, well, if we're going to give Labour a column, we should probably give the SNP something as well. And I think ultimately it just makes sense for the readers. It's right that the MP is featured in the newspaper, absolutely right that the local MSP, and there might be more than one, of course, and also local councillors as well. So I actually think across the week, maybe not always at once, but across a week, I think these newspapers have a good bit of balance. And often those sort of contributor pages or columns will be written by the MP or whoever it is. The newspaper themselves don't really tell them what to write about. There might be a bit of discussion. I've never been a politician. I had a newspaper column and they never really told me what to write about or what not to write about. Sometimes they'd say, oh, can you make it a bit lighter, or it would be great if you mentioned this. But I would have quite a bit of free rein. And in my experience and from what I've heard, the Paisley Daily Express is pretty good when they ask an elected representative to write for them. They'll tidy it up a little bit. They might reduce it for space reasons, etc. Pretty much allowed to say whatever they like within reason. So that's Alison Taylor, top of page 7. Bottom half of page 7 is an advert. Then we get into page 8, which is the MP essentially being criticised a little bit. So in her column, she's talking about Happy New Year and here's all the good things I'm doing and here's how I'm trying to help you. And of course, she says nothing about Labour's vote on the WASPy women and the pensions, and Labour being accused of hypocrisy. And obviously, as a Labour MP, she was criticised in amongst that. So Edel Keneally has written a story here, basically with the MP, I think defending herself, I suppose, in the midst of some criticism. We know in newspapers, by the way, that stories on the right-hand facing page, so typically the odd-numbered pages, get more attention and are more widely read than those on the left-facing pages. So generally what you would do is a big human interest story you'd put on an odd-numbered page, and something a bit duller, a bit technical, quite often something political, would be on the left-hand page, an even-numbered page. So it's quite interesting that Alison Taylor's column is on a right-hand facing page, probably going to get more attention. And then the article, which is criticising her a little bit, is quite a political story, is on a left-hand facing page. So if I was her, I wouldn't feel too bad about that. Page 9 is now moving into national news. So we've got Liam Payne's death inquest. We've got a story from the Department of Transport about the rollout of electric vehicle charging. We've got a story about the SAS. We've got the stabbing of the teenage boy in Woolwich in London. No bylines on that. We don't know where this has come from. My guess is this is agency copy, maybe from the Press Association, or maybe other reporters within the Trinity Mirror or the Reach PLC network. And if you go and buy several newspapers in a day, which I'm with, my brother laughs at me because I still buy newspapers, what you'll find is you'll see some repetition among these stories. So if you buy the Paisley Daily Express and the Daily Record and the Mirror and the Daily Express, you'll see that maybe the coverage of, for example, Liam Payne's inquest, it might be the same version of that story across those different titles. Then we've got world news. Now we've got the wildfires in the US. Obviously, your kind of national tabloid newspaper, they'll go bigger with that. Might have that on the front page, might go really big on the images. Paisley Daily Express tells us about it. So if you only buy one newspaper today, if you spend your £2, my God, £2 for the Paisley Daily Express, you do get world news. You know that there's wildfires in California, but it's not treated with the same prominence. You're not seeing the pictures that you would if you were to buy, for example, the Mirror or the Daily Record, okay? Because they don't want to compete with each other too much. The idea is this is the Paisley, Renfrewshire, but you might be more inclined to spend your £2 on it if you're also getting some national, international news as well. Then there's an advert for Slimming World, some news in brief about Donald Trump and about a journalist getting freed in Iran. Then an advert for the newspaper, a half-price subscription for the next 6 months. Then we've got several pages of puzzles, crosswords, a kind of photo montage across pages 12 and 13 about a charity football initiative from St Mirren. Again, I would think largely this has come from the organisation themselves. I'm not sure there's much, reporting going on. It actually says for more information or to book a place, visit the St Mirren FC Foundation website. And it's this balance between, well, of course, it's kind of free publicity for this organisation, but they're very much doing something for community good. So the newspaper are quite happy to deal with it. So they're getting easy content and the organisation gets some goodwill and some publicity and helps them with their endeavours. And it's a win-win. And that's what community and democracy is. And that's why this stuff's important. Because how are you going to see that on Facebook? You'll see it if you follow the St Mirren Foundation. But if you've just got kids in the area and you don't know what's going on, how are you going to know? We can't rely on Facebook serving that up. And so there's such an important role for local news. And that's why it's so important that these titles still exist, because this is probably not going to make the Daily Record. Now, it might be somewhere on their website, but I'm not sure people trawl through the Daily Record website or the pages of it relating to Paisley and Renfrewshire to try and find these stories. People just don't do that. There's absolutely a role here for local printed physical newspapers. Then we've got the TV listings across pages 14 and 15. I know that this comes centrally. Then we've got business pages, which have come from City AM. So I think one of the problems with this, and this is sometimes where you see mistakes start to happen, is that unless the Paisley Daily Express have been really careful and proofreading all of this and checking it, you've got stories here basically from City AM, and there's no attempt to reference Scotland or Paisley or Renfrewshire. It's basically just national business news pasted in to the local newspaper, which is fine. You're getting a bit of business news, but there's not really much local context. And if there was an important piece of Renfrewshire business news, if it's not been picked up by the local democracy reporter, if it's not big enough that one of the other news reporters would get to it, where's it going to go in this newspaper? Because the business news comes from City AM and it's got half of page 16, and then we've got an advert for Kelly Holmes' biography. Then we've got a flashback page on page 17, which all seems to be old sort of showbiz news from the 90s and through the years. Then we've got someone else, Ian Bunting, talks about television, another TV page. Then a whole page of funeral notices, which is a revenue stream as well for local newspapers, as sad as that might be. Still important to the audience that they want to, highlight a loved one's death. It's still a way that a lot of people might find out that someone that they know has died, is they'll see the notice in the newspaper. So again, if that's important to the audience, if that's important to people, then it's good that exists, can still exist in a newspaper, and it gives a newspaper some revenue as well. Page 20 is classified ads. This is where a lot of local advertising is. although what you'll see is even there's quite a lot of more general advertising. The amount of local advertising in here is not that great. So I think if you are a local business looking to advertise in a local newspaper, I really think they'd be very interested in speaking with you. And you might find that there's a good deal. You might find that there's a good opportunity in there. What you're going to do, you're going to bust your ass trying to climb up Facebook, or are you going to maybe advertise in a local newspaper? They have websites and social channels themselves that they'll be able to extend that across. They're all doing these integrated deals now, so it's not just an advert in a local newspaper. There's a digital package often that will come with that as well. And then we've got page 21, which is looking back at shock results of the FA Cup third round. And I think this is where I would like to see more investment from the local newspapers. Okay, you've got your local democracy reporter, you're selling this newspaper for £2 a day, and you've got a whole page and it's shock results of the FA Cup, English FA Cup third round. Does their audience really want that? I don't think they do. I would find it very hard to justify the whole of page 21, dominated by Leeds United, Wrexham, Stevenage and Shrewsbury Town winning unexpected FA Cup matches. I think there's something better that they could put in there. Then it's a horse racing page. Then now we're in the sports section, and we've got rugby union from Exeter. We've got an Afghani Olympian calling for an England cricket boycott. Something about UK athletics. A golfer, Grayson Murray. Harriet Dart at the tennis. I mean, okay, if you're broadly interested in sport, there's a whole page of it. It's certainly not just Scottish football. And then on the back page, we've got the latest story about St Mirren. So they've spoken to Stephen McGinn, who's one of the under-18s coach. This is Taylor Murray's name again, crops up here on the back page. It looks to me like Taylor Murray has gone out to St Mirren, interviewed one of the coaches, and that is their back page. Now, there was SPFL football in Scotland last night. Celtic played, Kilmarnock played, Dundee United again. These results last night are not in this newspaper. They do not appear. So if you wanted live football and a match report, well, you'd be buying the Daily Record and all that and the pictures, because it's not in here. If it had been a St Mirren match, I think it probably would have been, although the print deadlines sometimes can be tricky. Typically, the Paisley Daily Express, I believe, goes through the printed presses earlier than the Daily Record, which means the Daily Record has more up-to-date news. Paisley Daily Express used to, when I was a kid, it didn't come out until later in the day, which gave them a bit more time to get things up to date. But now I think it prints a little earlier in the evening, which means late night football, even if they wanted to cover it, is tricky. Although often, if St Mirren are playing, like I say, there will be a match report. Today they've obviously thought, well, we've got our story here about St Mirren, and they're not playing, so it's a Celtic game, it's a big one. We'll let the Daily Record handle that. So all of that is to say, when you get a local newspaper, most of the relevant news, in this edition at least, but I see this quite often, is coming from the local democracy reporter. The local democracy reporter is absolutely key to this whole operation. Doing a terrific job, probably pretty busy, worth getting to know. Please don't bother them with self-promotional nonsense. Only something that involves planning, that involves a local authority. But if you are in that world, then expect the local democracy reporter to be taking an interest. And then don't be surprised if it's a big enough story that if you speak to them and you think it's a Paisley story, remember there's lots of other people in other newsrooms that might be picking it up as well. So local newspaper, local democracy, page 1, page 2, another reporter, page 3, local democracy, page 4 and 5, archive, page 6, MP, page 7, UK-wide news with a bit of a local slant, page 8, UK national, page 9, world stories, page 10, puzzles, local charity with lots of pictures across pages 12 and 13, TV, business news from City AM, old TV or showbiz, things to watch on TV, funeral notices, classified ads, FA Cup, English football, horse racing, world sport, local football. That's your newspaper. That's your local newspaper. That is 24 pages of local newspaper for £2. So where's your story going to go? If you're a local business, if you're taking on new staff, you've won an award, you're shouting about something, where's it going to go? It's going to be really tough. You need relationships. You need pictures. It needs to pass the so what test. It needs to be engaging. I think you also need to appreciate these local newspapers are taking a longer term view. You might talk to them today and the story goes in the newspaper maybe the end of next week because they're working on limited resource and limited inventory. There's 24 pages usually, and you can see that there's a lot of those pages are taken up with other stuff. Part of what they've been through over the last 20 years is shrinking things down and filling the newspaper with essentially syndicated content. So to make it easier for them to run their operation, they now only have to fill, there's only a certain number of slots for news that they have to fill. Now, my hope is that as things improve and recover, that they might invest a little bit more and they might start making things better and local organisations and businesses can get a bit more involved and the whole thing starts to grow again. But that's where we're at today. And I think it really highlights the very important role of the local democracy reporters up and down the country. So I hope that's been useful insight into how at least one section of the local media works.